When talking about the issue of reforming our policing system, I think it's just absolutely necessary to first acknowledge that racism is just widespread and institutionalized in American society, but perhaps most obvious in our criminal justice system. I've now recorded numerous episodes where I talk about race in the recent protests, so instead of kind of rehashing that ground, I just encourage you to check out those previous episodes for more on my take for this particular issue if you haven't already, especially if you're already someone who's shaking your head in disagreement, because let's be honest, it's impossible for me to convince you that we must reform a system if you don't even see that system as broken. If you understandably don't have that kind of time, though, then I'd recommend watching a recent segment from John Oliver about policing in America and how, more generally, our education system and culture has just racism baked into it. But for now, I just want to focus on the solutions that activists have long been demanding. Now, these reforms have been presented under numerous different organizations and slogans, most notably being Black Lives Matters and Defund the Police. And while these two particular movements are indeed very separate in their specific demands, I believe that they're rather similar as a whole in terms of what they hope to achieve in the long term, and definitely not nearly as radical as many on the right portray them to be. So, with that said, let's talk really quick about what defunding the police actually means and how these movements hope to reform policing in general. Now, I am certainly no expert on this, but I've learned that despite what many on the right think, this overall movement is not about eliminating the police entirely. Although, again, there are obviously certainly those who do support this. But instead, it involves, and I'm quoting straight from, I believe, the Defund Police website, quote, strategically reallocating resources and responsibility away from police and toward community-based models of safety, support, and prevention. So basically, by reinvesting in things like public health, housing, employment, and education, we can prevent many of the crimes that police have to deal with on a daily basis instead of just perpetuating this system of punishment that just does not work. Proponents argue that by adopting these different priorities in policing, cities will improve public safety and just ultimately decrease the need for police in general. Now, in terms of reducing the number of fatal police shootings, there are plenty of reforms worth considering, such as increasing the amount of training required for police cadets, mandating police departments to keep data on police killings, which many are not required to do, or even just increasing the basic requirements of entry for policing in general. Now, I know many Trumpers hate comparing the US to any country because, we're number one and all, but the truth is, if we just look around the world, we can learn a lot from just briefly examining how other countries handle policing. Police in the US, for example, undergo far less training, about 21 weeks, than the vast majority of police in most European countries, who receive, on average, 2 to 3 years of training. And the results are pretty evident, with the number of people killed by police in every developed country representing a far smaller proportion of their overall population than what we see here in the US, even in countries where the overall rate of crime is higher. Now, obviously, there are numerous other factors that come into account here, including the overwhelming number of guns in this country. But the point is, our overall system of policing here is just broken, and we need to seriously consider some, if not all, of the reforms that activists are demanding, because the momentum is honestly on our side. Now, much like how the overwhelming majority of Americans support things like common sense gun reform, the same is true with many policing reforms. According to recent polling, 88% of Americans support more de-escalation and use of force training. 87% support body cameras for all officers, which also the vast majority of cops also support. 80% of Americans support establishing an early warning system for problematic officers, and 67% of Americans support banning neck restraints. So aside from these reforms themselves, the majority of Americans also support the protests as a whole and just believe that racism is a serious issue that requires addressing. In today's polarized world, it's kind of hard to believe that such agreement is remotely possible on any issue, especially on an issue as divisive as race. However, 2/3 of Americans now think police are more likely to use violent force against black people, which is significant given that only 2 years ago that number was 1/3 of Americans. Now, This rise in support for the protests does not obviously necessarily mean that Americans dislike police. In fact, the majority of Americans, including black people, want more police. This has long been the case. So, for example, in 2014, 2 days after the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which essentially gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement, the majority of black residents in that neighborhood said they wanted more police, not less, but that they just wanted to be treated like equal citizens and not as they had been treated. According to Gallup's annual poll of Americans' trust in different institutions, only 3 institutions have had majority support over the last 20 plus years, and those are military, small business, and the police. Now, granted, I don't believe that poll has been conducted this year, as far as I know, but in 2019, 53% of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the police. And even if that percentage is likely smaller this year, my guess is it won't be by too much, given the trends of the past. Now, I'm sure there are some listening who may agree with the overall goal of the protest, but perhaps think that this idea of divesting from the police still sounds crazy and just not the right approach. And to these folks, I'll say, let's just consider the following facts. In the last 40 years, the cost of policing in the U.S. has tripled, with state and local governments spending approximately $115 billion a year on policing, despite the fact that crime has been consistently declining over that same period of time. Now, spending on police has also continued to increase nationwide during the coronavirus crisis, despite massive other spending cuts to community budgets. Also, you can't really talk about police reform without acknowledging the flaws in our just larger criminal justice system, as I mentioned earlier, and how the U.S. has by far the highest incarceration rate in the world, with nearly half of federal inmates imprisoned for nonviolent drug-related crimes. The cost on taxpayers to house each of these inmates, by the way, is about like $37,000 a year, which comes out to about $100 a day. And I say all this because, put simply, we just have an economy of punishment and not prevention. For example, New York City spends more on policing than it does on its departments of health, homeless services, housing preservation and development, and youth and community development combined. So instead of investing in these programs, we instead choose to treat our police officers like paramilitary forces, equipped with whatever equipment our actual military no longer needs. And cops clearly need sufficient training and resources to defend themselves and be effective, in their field. But the fact that they spend on average 8 hours in conflict de-escalation training and 130 hours in weapons and fighting training just kind of seems a bit fucked up. I know cops have a dangerous job, but that just can't be used as a justification for just letting them play army in our backyard with little repercussions if they mess up. Also, let's not ignore the fact that police rank 14th on the list of most dangerous jobs in the U.S., according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. So to put that into perspective, garbage men, truck drivers, and farmers rank 5th, 6th, and 7th on that list of workplace fatalities. So I'm just kind of frankly a bit tired of folks just using that as an excuse for all of this kind of reactionary violent behavior we've seen officers around the country demonstrate on a near regular basis. We get it. Your job is difficult and dangerous, but that cannot be your excuse for everything. I just feel like those on the right, and none more so than our current president, are just constantly playing the victim card while also trying to elevate the potential danger of any opponent who they portray as a threat, whether that be Biden, Antifa, the news media, or even just liberals in general. It's this same mentality that I think kind of enables cops to pull off just this immoral and often illegal behavior while feeling entirely justified in doing so. For example, just the last month, a court ruled against numerous members of Baltimore's elite task force who were revealed during court to have often kept fake guns on them in order to plant on innocent people if they happen to shoot an unarmed suspect. I mentioned this particular case because I think it's just representative of the larger problem, in that to many of the officers we've seen in viral police shooting videos, as well as their higher-ups who defend them, the ends justified the means. It also kind of just demonstrates the problem involved with addressing other large-scale problems like climate change, for example, and that there are always vested financial interests in maintaining the status quo. And in order to justify that, It requires rejecting reality, whether that be racism in policing or the fact that climate change is real. All right, so back to the protest, though. What have they actually achieved, if anything, and how have cities and states responded? In my first episode, I mentioned how the protests, in my mind, have already been successful simply for just making this issue of racial inequality and policing a matter of national concern that has engaged pretty much everyone in the conversation. But the effectiveness of this sustained activism has also been seen in terms of tangible action. Numerous cities and colleges around the country have announced plans to divest from local police, including New York City, where Mayor Bill de Blasio, for all his faults, announced that he would disband the controversial street clothes police unit and move some police funding to youth initiatives and community services. New York State legislators also repealed a statute that kept confidential the records of all officers accused of misconduct. And in San Francisco, the mayor announced similar reforms and said that police officers will stop responding to issues like neighborly disputes, reports of homeless people, and school discipline interventions. And that city is also moving forward with plans to strengthen accountability, demilitarize their police force, and promote economic justice. Another example, the police force in Eugene, Oregon, now reroute many of their 911 calls, especially those involving mental illness or homelessness, to an emergency health service called the White Bird Clinic. And last year, that clinic received 24,000 calls, and fewer than 1% of those did the White Bird service actually need to call for police backup as part of its response. Even in Kentucky, of all places, state legislators caved to activist pressure over the death of Breonna Taylor and passed legislation banning the use of no-knock warrants for drug-related cases, like the one that was used in her accidental fatal shooting. Now, it's, again, no surprise that police unions have come out in strong opposition to many of these reforms, including in Los Angeles, for example, where the mayor was one of the first to announce that their city would reallocate funds from its police force, to which the LAPD responded by stating, and I quote, "Budget cuts would be the quickest way to make our neighborhoods more dangerous." And the LAPD also threatened to pull cops off the street. And this response, like I said previously, is not surprising, given that any government institution or an organization, for that matter, is going to fight for more resources. But it's kind of worth noting that police spending in LA already accounts for more than half of the city's general fund, and the city only cut $150 million from the $1.8 billion spent on policing each year. So it's also worth noting in 2014, with regards to this threat that they would pull their cops off the street, in 2014, New York police officers staged a similar slowdown to protest spending cuts also. However, the result was just an immediate drop in crime, much like how the city also saw a drop in crime after it stopped the controversial practice of stop and frisk. Criminal justice researchers have since posited that this, old school aggressive policing of petty crimes, otherwise known as broken windows policing, just ultimately leads to more illegal behavior because it punishes poverty. And also it just creates an environment where crime is more likely, in part because it just tears apart families. Now, in Minneapolis, where the summer of protests began following the murder of George Floyd, the city council has probably gone the furthest in terms of listening to protest demands by vowing to completely dismantle its police department and, quote, end policing as the city knows it. And again, at first glance, this seems radical and counterproductive, but drastic approaches like this have actually been done before and had very promising results. For example, in 2012, Camden, New Jersey had some of the highest rates of crime in the country, with numerous police complaints and a murder rate on par with Honduras. Now, fed up with the broken system, the city completely disbanded its police force and rebuilt a new one that implemented many of the progressive reforms that activists are demanding today. And what was the result? Excessive use of force rates plummeted, the homicide rate decreased, the overall policing culture shifted away from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. But it's important to note that in order to achieve this goal, it required a massive amount of political will and sacrifice, even on behalf of the police officers whose salaries decreased. It also required a lot of cooperation between the Democratic City Council, the Republican governor, and the progressive activists, which leads me to my next point about how our current elected politicians at the highest levels of government have responded to the recent pressure for similar police reforms. And I'll start with the Democrats, who were the first to introduce legislation earlier this summer.